Hi. Welcome to the Hammer Museum. I'm Anne Ellegood, Senior Curator, and it's my pleasure to introduce this evening's program. Taking place in conjunction with the exhibition Sarah Lucas Au Naturel, a 30-year survey featuring over 140 works, which closes on September 1st. This is the first survey of Lucas's work in the US, and the first time her work has been shown in Los Angeles. The exhibition was organized by the New Museum in New York, and the Hammer is the only other venue on the American tour. So if you have not seen the exhibition yet, I urge you to do so in the next 2.5 weeks before it closes. For tonight's program, I'm excited and honored to bring three remarkable figures in the field of contemporary art to think through ways in which Lucas takes up the topic of gender and how it operates in our culture. We have gender and queer theorist Jack Halberstam, art historian Jenni Sorkin, and artist Candice Lin. I'm going to introduce each of them in more detail momentarily, but first I wanted to say a few words of introduction. In terms of the structure for the evening, I've asked each of the panelists to come up and do a short presentation on a specific topic of Lucas's work through the lens of gender and queer theory, drawing on their own interests and expertise. So I've given them particular prompts. We'll see how much they follow them or not, totally up to them. And then I think inevitably we will go far beyond those particular prompts, and there'll be overlapping areas of interest and investigation that we can pick up in a conversation that we'll have on stage after each of their presentations. They'll each speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have a conversation, and at the end we'll leave a few minutes for questions from the audience. Since the late 1980s, Sarah Lucas has created a distinctive and provocative body of work that subverts conventional constructions of identity based on gender and class primarily. Her works have been understood to challenge social norms and to engage in crucial debates about gender and power in our society. I wanted to have a conversation about gender specifically in conjunction with the show, and perhaps also the related but distinct topic of sexuality in Lucas's work, not only because of her long-standing commitment to delving into this terrain, but because in some recent meditations on Lucas's work, there have been questions posed and even some consternation expressed about how we might today understand her propositions regarding gender, both in terms of her earliest work, in which gender is presented largely in binary terms, and her more recent, far more ambiguous sculptures. Coming of age during the Thatcher era in the UK, Lucas has recalled that it was clear to her from a young age that, quote, everything is stacked against women. Excuse me. She emerged onto the art scene in the late 1980s as part of the Young British Artists, or better known as the YBAs, with Damien Hirst functioning as their de facto leader, and witnessed her male peers being immediately embraced by the art world's gallery structure and sites of critical recognition, while the women in the group, such as herself, Tracy Aman, Anya Galaccio, and several others, were initially largely on the sidelines. Not surprisingly, this pissed her off and fueled her ambition, but it also gave her a certain amount of freedom to make the work that came to her intuitively without being preoccupied with or giving a damn about its reception. It also meant that society's continuous failure to ensure female equity and safety from violence and oppression would become a primary subject of her work, just as unabashed and refreshingly shameless portrayals of the body and sexuality would also figure in the work consistently over time. In the New York Times review of the exhibition at the New Museum, art critic Martha Schwenender asked, quote, is Sarah Lucas right for the Me Too moment? Going on to argue that indeed she is, while also admitting to her discomfort with what she sees as the narrowness of the heteronormative politics found in the work. While Schwenender's inquiry into how Lucas might feel a bit out of step with current conversations about gender fluidity is certainly worth taking up, I was also struck by the ways in which she seemed to miss the mark in some of her interpretations of Lucas's sculpture and her blindness to the possibility that Lucas may have, in fact, already pushed her work into a space beyond gender nonconformity in binary terms and into forms that, in my opinion, suggest multigendered, trans, hybrid, and even perhaps post-human figures. In reference to Lucas's engorged and entwined stuffed stocking nud forms, which we'll look at soon, which started about a decade ago, Schwendener seemed to dismiss them as a mere continuation of her more decidedly female bunny sculptures, a claim I find difficult to square with the works themselves when actually looking at the nud sculptures. Schwendener also accuses Lucas of bringing a privileged sense of, quote, European ennui to her work, which also seems decidedly at odds with what I, for one, feel when viewing the work, which has far too much confrontational bravado, uninhibited anger, and laugh-out-loud humor to be understood as, quote, disaffected. Lucas's work has been described as making, quote, blunt yet ambiguous meditations on gender, quote, complicating gender and age stereotypes, and, quote, fusing man, woman, adolescent, and child. She has been called, and indeed has called herself, a, quote, rude woman, also a, quote, strong, self-determining woman who challenges oppression, dominance, and abuse. Her approach to sexuality specifically, not gender per se, has been called caustic, joyful, and deadpan. After spending time with Lucas during the 3-week installation of the show, her desire to place pleasure at the center of life experience struck me as remarkably radical, a lust for life that all too often women are discouraged from exhibiting in favor of an outmoded and frankly unhealthy fidelity to expectations of a demure comportment and still largely intact restrictive social mores. Lucas's do-as-I-please approach to her life and work is refreshing and inspiring, and yet it also magnifies the unfortunate circumstances that disallow so many women and trans people around the world from truly living their lives, the lives they desire and deserve. I look forward to our panelists taking up some of these issues and many other subjects this evening, and now I'm going to introduce them in the order that they will give their presentations. First, we have Jenni Sorkin. Jenni is an associate professor of the history of art and architecture at University of California, Santa Barbara. She writes on the intersections between gender, material culture, and contemporary art, working primarily on women artists and underrepresented media. She is the author of Live Form, Women, Ceramics, and Community from 2016, which examines the confluence of gender, artistic labor, and the history of post-war ceramics. She received her PhD in the history of art from Yale University in 2010 and is a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Modern Craft. She is the recipient of fellowships from the American Council of Learned Societies, the Center for Craft, the Getty Research Institute, the ACLS Luce Fellowship in American Art. In 2019, she will give the 23rd annual Peter Dormer Lecture at the Royal College of Art in London, Britain's most distinguished lecture series in the applied arts. Very cool. Jack Halberstam is a professor of gender studies and English at Columbia University. Halberstam is the author of 6 books, including Skin Shows, Gothic Horror and the Technology of Monsters, Female Masculinity, In a Queer Time and Place, The Queer Art of Failure, Gaga Feminism, Sex, Gender, and the End of Normal, and most recently, a short book titled Trans, A Quick and Quirky Account of Gender Variance. Places Journal awarded Halberstam its Arcus Places Prize in 2018 for innovative public scholarship on the relationship between gender, sexuality, and the built environment. Halberstam is currently working on several projects, including a book titled Wild Thing, Queer Theory After Nature, on queer anarchy, performance, and protest culture, and the intersections between animality, the human, and the environment. And lastly, Candice Lin. Candice Lin is an interdisciplinary artist who works with installation using living materials and processes such as mold, mushrooms, bacteria, fermentation, and stains. Lin has recent solo exhibitions at Ludlow 38 in New York, François Jabali here in LA, Porticus in Frankfurt, Beton Salon in Paris, and Gasworks in London, as well as group exhibitions at the ICA London. These are just in the last couple of years, Parasite in Hong Kong, and the Taipei Fine Arts Museum. She was included in the Hammers Made in LA last summer and also is an assistant professor at UCLA. So let's welcome Jenni to the stage and give a warm welcome to all 3 of the panelists. I don't know why that's there, because that's not mine, but I'll advance.
Thank you so much for everybody being here, and thank you to Anne for the opportunity to reflect on Sarah Lucas's work with such distinguished fellow panelists. So in her catalog essay, the art historian Anne Wagner makes comparisons, direct comparisons to Rachel White Reed, who is a contemporary of Sarah Lucas, both as a woman artist and as a Brit. She also talks a lot about Senga Nguti's pantyhose sculptures. But for me, I actually feel this is quite a stretch. I wanted to start here because these works actually might use the same object, but they are not actually doing the same things at all. White Reed is poetic and subtle and invested in beauty, and Lucas is none of those things. She's purposefully vulgar, she's dark, she's coarse, and she's frankly very anti-beauty. So I wanted to just start with that and then proceed, because I think Lucas is actually a hard sell in California without thinking closely about some of the works that have preceded her. And I'm not saying that she would have known any of this work, but I think that there's some interesting precedent here in California for her work being part of a larger landscape of what we might call bathroom humor. So Robert Arneson is a sculptor in ceramics who is not terribly well known on the East Coast or even here so much anymore. He died in 1992 of lung cancer, liver cancer actually, sorry. But I wanted to start with his work because I think that he's an important kind of vulgarian as somebody whose work was widely circulated for about 30 years on this coast and really comes out of a particular bent in terms of confronting ceramics as a minor art form. Certainly the toilet has a long, illustrious history in modern art. We can go back to Duchamp's The Fountain, which is an overturned urinal and is made of porcelain. So in thinking through porcelain as a quality of artistic production, is one of the most refined materials actually to use in ceramics, Arneson actually began making toilets. What you're seeing here is a work from 1964 called His and Hers. It pairs kind of pointy, flaccid breasts next to a penis. It's really reductive. It's reducing bodies to their parts. It's got these open, dark toilet seats. It's purposefully hand-molded, so he's not throwing any of this on the wheel. He's making these works by hand. There's something kind of icky in the toilet. It kind of looks like a pot leaf to me, but it's unclear what's there. But instead of having a flush, you have a penis, and you have these sort of pointy nipples up at the top. And it really is called His and Hers in the sense that he's trying to portray bodies as genitalia, ultimately. And in terms of Sarah Lucas' C-nut, we know that C-nut is really just a kind of swap for cunt. And it's always been a rather difficult word here in this country, which means something quite different perhaps in Britain. But cunt is also an incredibly vulgar word for women's vaginas, at least here. And that's something that many people can't get past, although has a really long, distinguished feminist history. So I did also want to point out that Lucas is using toilets over and over in her work. And I think that toilets are actually a difficult concept for Americans because we mask our toilets. We don't even call them toilets. We call them restrooms. We call them bathrooms. And when you go to Europe and you are confronted with having to ask where the toilet is, I think that that actually can be difficult for people. Maybe people are now too global for that and they're over it, but I think that there's many people who sort of swallow and have to take a breath before they ask for the toilet specifically. So in this work, Is Suicide Genetic? I do feel this interpretation is really, or at least my interpretation is that life is really like a shit sandwich, and that she's using feces as the ultimate expression, like almost like writing with your own shit, and that actually to me has real resonance with the kind of dark, suicidal histories and insane asylum art of somebody like Antonin Artaud, Zelda Fitzgerald, Camille Claudel, all people who were locked up in asylums and forced to express themselves at time with the only revolting tools that they had left, which is, in effect, shit, the ink produced by one's own body. So I think that there is a kind of real darkness in this that speaks to me in that sense, but is also has to do with a kind of cheeky act of questioning the legitimacy of depression simultaneously. So there's also something light and humorous about this. I want to go back to Arneson in the sense, so Arneson actually is he trains at Mills College, he gets his MFA, and then because there's nowhere to actually teach ceramics, he teaches junior high and then high school art, because that's what you did with a ceramics degree in the 50s. Eventually, he ends up at UC Davis in 1962, and he is really one of the primary teachers for Bruce Nauman. And so this kind of investment in the bodily and in the scatological is something that I think Nauman is directly linked to Arneson, but Arneson is often not credited as his teacher. It's usually like William Wiley. And so you see here that Arneson also chooses to write with shit, and in his John with Art, he's literally taking art into the space of the toilet. And flushing art down the toilet because ceramics is considered such a lowly materiality. And he's essentially rejecting the traditional forms of ceramics. So he's not making pots, he's not making utilitarian mugs or plates or jars. He's trying to move unencumbered into the world of avant-garde sculpture, but he's doing it in the most vulgar ways possible, a lot like Sarah Lucas is doing. And I do want to just go sort of proceed quickly into the future here. So 10 years after all of this work, Arneson is also the father of what's called funk art. I'm going to go back for a second. And he's included in a famous important show that happens at the Berkeley Art Museum in '67. And then he is picked up and included, he's the only West Coast artist to be included in a Dada and Surrealism show at MoMA. That William Rubin curates in '68 after seeing his work in a funk show. And the funk show is about the visual vernacular. And so the vernacular is a kind of about the ordinary domesticity. Toilets certainly count in terms of being ordinary, domestic, and commonplace objects. And then the kind of porcelain production that happens a decade later is Judy Chicago. And the dinner party is a piece that starts here in Los Angeles and Santa Monica, is made over a period of 5 years with many, many volunteers. And Judy Chicago also sort of puts these very proud cunts on display. And the use of the word cunt within the feminist context is actually about body positivity and celebration. So it's about taking back ownership over a word that is previously derogatory, like queer or like fag. And so in this sense, this becomes about reifying the beauty of the vagina through porcelain dinner pieces and plates that represent forgotten and overlooked women, artists, politicians, etc. I'm going to end on this slide, which is Sarah Lucas's Wanker Destiny. And this is a mechanical jack-off hand. I think it's actually one of the most funny pieces in the show. It's a kind of mirrored narcissism that's going on inside this box, and you can see it jack off. I did want to point out that there are artists who are working, I think, in this vein. Zoe Bruckman is a British artist who's a generation younger than Lucas, who I think is looking back to this work. This is a piece called Champ, which is not kinetic, although she does do some kinetic work, but I think can be envisioned as a kind of kinetic inheritor of Wanker Destiny in the sense that Champ becomes about kind of punching or punching outward and having a place made for the female body, making space for thinking through women's genitalia in a way that I think Sarah Lucas doesn't do, actually. I think that Lucas is much more invested in representations of the male body often as a kind of the point of or the butt of a joke. And I think that that's something I'd like to actually talk about when we all get up here, about the prevalence or overprevalence of male bodies, even if they're being shamed or diminished in some way. Thank you.
All right, good evening, everybody. I'm very happy to be here and excited to be in conversation with my co-panelists and with you all about this show and about the timing of this show. I will, by the end of my presentation, try to get to this question of what it means to revisit Sarah Lucas's work in the moment that we're in, where we're both, really pushing back on binary gender on the one hand, and then really questioning heteronormative sexuality on the other. Does her work participate in those kinds of questions? Or is it in some way participating in setting up a kind of patriarchal system? And that's, the sort of artistic rendition of a patriotic set of symbols. So I want to move towards that question and offer up some answers. But let me just, I just have kind of three things that I want to say by way of provoking some conversation. First of all, that I think we have to consider this work in relationship to what I would call post-natural sexuality. Post-natural sexuality. And now, I'm not saying that sexuality was ever natural. Clearly, it was not. But even the title of this show, Au Natural, calls attention to the way in which the production of something natural has a kind of political orientation to it. So what would it mean to have sexuality, bodies, desires after nature? One thing that comes to mind in terms of the imagery in Sarah Lucas's show is how much she calls attention to how weighty the body is. Like, there's a lot of these images that are cast in concrete or in bronze, and there's a sense that she's not, we maybe misread her as trying to capture the meaning of embodiment, when I think one arc of her work would be to say how heavy it is to wear a body, and how she might see that there's a difference in the way in which the female form holds embodiment and the way that the male form wears its embodiment. So, notice the materials and when she's using soft materials and when she's using not just hard materials, but literally concrete materials, materials that propose weight, if not profundity. And I don't think it is profundity. But to continue with this post-natural, I want to start. I want to start with one of her earlier pieces that I think begins this movement towards the post-natural, and I actually find this piece really hilarious. And when you have penis nailed to a board. You can't not read that as a kind of aggressive statement on male sexuality. And you get the headline there, which is an interesting reference compared to the headlines that we have nowadays in relationship to Me Too. Here the headline, penis nailed to a board in sex game. And this provokes Lucas to try to create a board game with like little stand-up figures from all of the figures who are part of this sex ring in the 1970s or whenever this piece came out. One of the things that I think Lucas was doing early on was trying to capture the atmosphere in just a little bit pre-Thatcher Britain, where every day, you could open up the Sun newspaper and see a new pin-up girl on page 3. And, having grown up in the 1970s in England, there's something that she captures about this saturation of the public sphere with a kind of Benny Hill style of wink, wink, nudge, nudge orientation to sexuality. Like, what sexuality is in 1970s Britain is something that we need to understand in order to understand what follows in her work. And what that sexuality was made up of were these, on the one hand, lurid revelations where you find out that the police force in England has nothing better to do most of the time than chase down sex rings that were involved in increasingly bizarre activities so that there was something to put in the newspaper the next day. And there was this deep fascination with the kind of seamy side of sexuality that nonetheless was built around the idea that men had these deep and broad sexual imaginaries and sexual imaginations, and women are simply the pieces on the board game being moved around. And that's the atmosphere into which Lucas launches these quite aggressive and humorous works like Penis Nailed to a Board. And I think by the time you get to the end of looking at a bunch of the penises in Lucas's show, the idea of a penis nailed to a board means something really different than what the guys in the sex ring had in mind in their sort of masochistic fantasy. It's turned into a much more sort of sadistic, feminist fantasy about detaching patriarchal sexuality or something. And I want to then sort of, but just to go back for 1 minute, the other context for this is, I don't know if you guys remember a few years ago when all of these news items came up about Jimmy Savile. Does anyone remember Jimmy Savile here? Thank you, one person. Jimmy Savile was a DJ in the 1970s in England, and after his death, it was discovered that he had had thousands, hundreds of interactions with young girls and young boys. Not only had he had these pedophilic interactions, but the BBC, who he worked for, had delivered the children to him. In other words, he was sort of an emblem for a massive sex ring known as English masculinity. And it's English masculinity that Sarah Lucas, in many ways, comes to nail to the board. This piece, I think, we want to then revisit, and this, I don't know if this is in the Hammer, is it? No, so this one was made very specifically in New Jersey, in Matthew Barney's studio, no less, for the new museum show. It was a brand new piece, This Jaguar's Going to Heaven, and you can see that the work does not remain in the binary configuration that we see early on, and that then gets critiqued as being inappropriate to this Me Too moment. There's an arc to the work. You have to start in the 70s, begin with English masculinity, and then move towards this much more prosthetic reckoning with sexuality that you get in a piece like this. And this piece for me, and I'll do this more quickly, asks us to think about what I would call Viagra-supported masculinities that are already deeply prosthetic. In other words, there is no au naturel any longer post-Viagra, post-nature. There is no such thing as just simply virility. There's only supported virility, pharmaceutical virility, and this is a kind of rendition of exactly that. So there are a couple of questions that this piece asked. Can we re-articulate the body using a whole array of materials, both machinic and fleshly, in order to articulate its meanings in the digital age? So that's one question. How do we articulate to each other what the meaning of the body is now? What happens to representations of the body in an era where we don't believe in the binary anymore? The binary collapses. We have they, them, theirs pronouns. We understand that gender is a spectrum. And here you see that the Jaguar car, the sign of a kind of luxury commodity, but also of midlife male crisis, has been literally split down the middle and rendered as problematic within a moment of deep climate crisis. But there's also a commentary here, I think, on jaguar, both as car and as a kind of animality that is facing extinction in relationship to this commodity fetishism. And then I think that piece is quite interesting in relationship to Nicole Eisenman's work, and here again, you see the weightiness of the body that is being re-articulated by Eisenman in much more clear relationship to a kind of queer understanding, a queer critique of the body. I think of this piece as a deep critique of something like Stonewall at 50 and its fantasies of liberation, as if like, oh, we've come so far and here we are now finally celebrating that we are free, and the reduction of all of queer activism to this one moment in this one bar involving these few people. This procession is a reminder of how weighty history is and how history does not appear in these abbreviated forms that we wish upon it. Prosthetic sex. What can you say? There's a bunch of these types of pieces in Sarah Lucas where she is not simply engaging the phallus as prosthetic, but is quite interested also in the cut up, and the cut up being like very literally this humorous joke that she is literally cutting and eating the phallic object, and then what the art is a kind of the return of the phallic object as shit or as bodily process and so on. I also would, however, place some of this these works that are humorously engaged with the phallus within what Paul Preciado has called contrasexual, a kind of contrasexual moment. And contrasexuality for Preciado is a recognition that this fantasy of male bodies and female bodies involved in a kind of heteronormative dance along the path to reproduction is a completely, is just that, is completely a fantasy and is over because all sexuality in the era that we live in is prosthetic. All sexuality is prosthetic. And that, I believe, is one of the big takeaways from Sarah Lucas's work from the 1990s through to the present, is that there is no such thing as natural sexuality. There is, almost by implication, no heterosexuality. There is only the body with its various kinds of dildonic extensions that then organize the meaning of the body. And the nutties are probably the best example of exactly that. And the nutties are, there are lots and lots of penises in Sarah Lucas's work, but the nutties are in some way referring to a different understanding of genitality that is not just sort of phallic versus vaginal, not just the chicken knickers versus the penises, but is much more about the soft forms of the body, any number of which could be interpreted as genital. In other words, we're so focused on vagina and penis, but what other parts of the body can be inscribed into genitality? All right, I want to end with two pieces. One very new and one very old that I think do answer the question asked by Martha Schwender whether Sarah Lucas's work is right for the Me Too movement. And I mean, I don't think everything needs to be gauged in relationship to the Me Too movement, which has its own problems. But actually, Schwender had a different kind of point to make. She wrote, "In this era, post-Brexit, when thousands of people have died in recent years attempting to reach the safety of shabby London or any toehold in Western Europe, the message here of being white and bored and disaffected feels dissonant." Okay, and that's a different argument than like, oh, in the Me Too moment of a reckoning with patriarchy, this work full of penises and vaginas doesn't quite sit well. This is a different argument. This is an argument about whether we can afford the kind of white ennui that has been part and parcel of European avant-garde for so long in this moment of global migration, refugees, rising fascism, right-wing populism, and so on. And I think that this is a good question for us to take up in the Q&A. So 2 questions that sort of maybe would allow us to respond to that critique. Something new, Vox Pop Doris, that took its place in the window of the new museum, and is just, the sort of the cutoff of these boots. It's not even legs, it's boots, reminding us that we wear the body, to go back to that idea of the weightiness of the body, and that the boots, also sort of prop up the body in some way. The boots make me think of the fantastic Bee movie. That is a good moment for this movie. Even if people don't think it's a good time for Sarah Lucas's work, it's a great time for Attack of the 50-Foot Woman. If anyone remembers that great Bee movie in which a woman becomes a giant after an encounter with an alien and uses her new height advantage to terrorize her philandering husband and kill both him and the guy that she was sort of interested in. So the good guy and the bad guy and her rival, all of them she destroys. It's a fantastic film. At the time it was declared, 1958 was declared the worst science fiction movie ever made, and everyone loved it. And I feel that this is trying to say something about the kind of the elevation of not female power per se, but of an anti-patriarchal power that needs to be reckoned with. Finally, something old. Big Fat Anarchic Spider is one of my favorite pieces in the whole show. And this is part of a series of soft sculptures in which, in this one, taking the idea of the stuffed toy and turning it into something grotesque, she also sort of spells out the way in which the spider has a kind of solidness, like the stuffed toy is something you want to hug, and it's sort of lightweight and moves around. This one seems so heavy again. There's a kind of weightiness to the spider, and the anarchy that it comes to sow obviously has something to do with its inability to inhabit the role of transitional object that's supposed to allow the child to move out of the parent's care, and instead spells a reversal, perhaps, of the relationship between parent and child, the anarchy of all of these reversals that Sarah Lucas' work is engaged in. And the fullness or softness of the spider, it seems to me, needs to be compared to the shiny tumescence of Jeff Koons' work. That would be this is a good way to sort of critique this notion of the sort of ever hard, erectile sculptures that Jeff Koons, revels in, with this soft, squishy, grotesque version of the art object. This spider, female and fatal, reeks of both mortality and murder. She lives and kills. She's grown full on the bounty of human decline, and she revels anarchically in our collapse. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming, and that was really amazing. I'm so thrilled to be in conversation with Jack, Jenni, and Anne. I'm going to go a little off my prompt. Animal, ass, bat, cracker, dragon, meat, muff, old bag, piece, skirt, slag, socket, tart, tit, whore, witch. These are some of the words that are on one of the 5 lists that Sarah Lucas wrote in pencil on paper. They're lists of derogatory words used in this case to describe women. So when I was visiting the exhibition, and I have to say I didn't know Sarah Lucas's work very well before visiting this exhibition, I found myself thinking a lot about the scholar Mel Y. Chen's work in their book Animacies, which looks at how language reveals and inscribes social hierarchies of power. So using insults as an example and an animacy hierarchy, here you can see a kind of bad screenshot of it, sorry for the blurriness. that was developed by linguist John Cherry. Melchen uses this to look at how our social hierarchy, which places an able-bodied white cis man at its apex, is activated when we use language around insults. So, for example, the cis man could be insulted through a gender demotion within this hierarchy to call him a woman, or by objectifying him as a part of his body instead of a whole thinking subject by calling him an asshole, or through a kind of species demotion by calling him a different kind of animal like a dog or a pig, or even a vegetable. So anyway, this is a little bit dry, but for me it was like a really interesting way to think about how language kind of structurally reinscribes the kind of dehumanization processes that are at work in our kind of most banal everyday social interactions. So as I was walking through this exhibition, I was struck by how Sarah Lucas's sculptures and installations physicalize what are sometimes to me still misogynistic jokes and insults. And I was finding myself kind of disturbed by their elegance and their seduction, and also drawn in by their kind of awkward anthropomorphism and the pathos that kind of created in me, and also sometimes laughing at jokes that I was like questioning myself why I was laughing at it, and felt kind of implicated in that. So as I was having all these thoughts and feelings walking around the show, and knowing that I was going to speak to you guys and wondering what I was going to say, I noticed that one thing that was happening for me was that I was having a kind of bodily understanding of this kind of animacy hierarchy. And I found myself wondering, like, what happens when somebody who's maybe intended to be the butt of the joke becomes the teller of the joke? Like, is that enough? Does that make clear the kind of animacy hierarchy that's held up by these jokes and insults? Does it make us question our implication within these kind of systems as we catch ourselves laughing at these jokes? Is it a way of making those kind of all too familiar jokes unfamiliar and different and make us question them, or does it kind of reify them? I don't have an answer for that, but it was a question I had. So one of the words that was missing from that list was also used as a slogan by Lucas in the T-shirts that she made with Tracy Emin in their storefront. It said, "She's kebab," and also as part of this sculpture, 2 fried eggs in a kebab. I was really fascinated by this because maybe I had never heard of that insult. Maybe it's not an American thing to call a vagina a kebab, but also because it also was one of the few materials that I saw overtly that had a cultural specificity beyond the kind of overarching cultural specificity of all the work, which I saw as being about a kind of white working class British culture. In this case, the kebab, I don't exactly know what cultural specificity that would be. Some people say that it was invented by a Turkish immigrant living in Germany, Kadir Nurman, but he himself says that actually, no, it's like a kind of form of food that was in Turkey, the other countries in the Middle East, and Greece. So it's not specifically important that it is another cultural specificity, but it's important to me that it's this kind of othered, non-white presence in the work. So to return to the animacy hierarchy with the phrase "she's kebab," the phrase kind of operates through this double or triple substitution where the woman as a thinking subject becomes replaced with just genitalia, which then get replaced by a doner kebab, which stands in also as a kind of sublimated racial identity. And just to be clear, I don't think that that's something that Sarah Lucas is thinking about or intending necessarily. I think her work is mostly like a clear gendered and class critique. But it was actually because of that I got really interested in these kind of moments of absence of race or kind of sublimation of racial politics. So this is kind of the lens that I was looking at the show with. And with this lens, I couldn't help but read some of the bunnies as racialized Playboy bunnies, especially the ones with darker brown or medium brown tights. And Lucas made a deliberate choice when she chose to use tights of different colors, and obviously tights are different colors to match different colors of skin, and so they are a kind of undeniable racial presence for me. And I was curious to think about these bunnies and their color, especially in relationship to the other figurative works like the white plaster cast muses. And I also noticed that in the catalog, the material list for the bunnies read as specifically brown or tan tights, which is curious because the later works using tights like the Nutties and some other works just refer to them as tights, and there's no color specified, so I was curious about why that was. So thinking about the bunnies in relationship to the whiteness of the muse sculptures, I was thinking about this kind of history of race. And I think the way these sculptures are usually talked about is as a kind of critique of male heroic sculpture in white marble or bronze. And these are kind of female casts of her friends. And they're in white plaster, which is a kind of cheaper material. So it's in that kind of is like the way that I've heard it be talked about. But so for me, I was interested in taking on thinking about this art historical trope in general about these white stone or white plaster sculptures that have so often stood in for this kind of neutral everyman, but is actually tied to a very racialized history, one that kind of denies a very well-known fact that Greek and Roman sculptures were not white, but were polychromed, often in very vibrant colors and patterns. And so it's like there's been decades of scholarship on this fact, and yet that this kind of way that whiteness still operates in sculptures as a kind of neutral, I think is a kind of after effect of that history. And Nell Painter writes about it in her book, The History of White People, where she says, quote, "Color in sculpture came to mean barbarism, for they assumed that the lofty ancient Greeks were too sophisticated to color their art. The equation of color with primitivism meant that experts often suppressed and removed color when they found it." 18th century art historian Johann Winkelmann perpetuated this myth of whiteness in classical statuary and saw the Apollo Belvedere sculpture as the epitome of beauty and perfection. This specific sculpture was also used in scientific racist theories and diagrams that analyzed the angles and proportions of the sculpture's body and skull and profile and compared them to the bodies and skulls of actual non-white peoples to prove the sculpture and the whiteness's superiority. So as Jenni spent a bit of time talking about, another white object that appears a lot in Lucas's work is the toilet. And the history of the toilet and the material it's made out of, porcelain, is something I've spent quite a bit of time in my own research on, and was linked to racialization of cleanliness and hygiene. And porcelain itself was a material that was described as a superior white body that was prized for being impregnable to staining and breaking. So at the risk of being really, I don't know what it is, reductive and being that sculpture's white, what is this all about? I was walking through and I was oh, these white sculptures from the Penetralia series, I actually kind of like them. They're the ones that kind of combine casts of twigs and stones and penises, and they have a really nice totemic kind of feeling of them. And I was oh, the white plaster in this case is unifying these different objects from different sources in a way that I can pay attention to form. And that's actually usually the argument given as to why students of sculpture still use white plaster as a big medium, because it helps you kind of reduces the elements so that you pay attention to form more. And so I was thinking okay, I'm kind of overreading my racial paranoia looking at this show. And then I came to the middle of this display and I looked up and I was is that a swastika or is that just me? And and I don't think maybe it's not a swastika. I think maybe it's definitely a swastika. Okay. Okay. I was like, okay, it's not just me. That's good to know. So I'm not saying that Sarah Lucas is a white supremacist or anything like that. I thought maybe it was about fascism, maybe it's about death. It's also probably makes sense that this series is about her move from the city to the country, and these sites are kind of like agrarian tools, right? So it's not so much for me like thinking about like trying to figure out what the racial intention of Sarah Lucas was, but the more I spent time with the work, I was realizing my own implication within these kind of systems of power and how they govern the way that I was looking at the work and the questions that I was asking of it, and also the kind of limitation of my lens in terms of how I was looking at it. And so for me, what became most interesting about the work is this question of implication, and I think it's a question that Lucas is fully self-aware of. I think Lucas doesn't shy away from the fact of being self-implicated. She self-implicates herself in all the self-portraits. She self-implicates herself in these kind of offensive jokes she's not afraid to make with the sculptures. And she's implicated in, other people's as my own reading of the work. So even as she calls into question and says, fuck you, to different systems of power, she's pointing out the kind of limitations of her position as it is embedded within those same systems. And this makes me, as a viewer, ask myself these same very questions. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Wow. Okay. That's a lot to absorb and try to unpack a little bit. I'm not quite sure where to start because there's so much. And there may be particular topics that you've each touched upon that you also want to pick up on of one another. But I thought, did you bring the clicker?
I can go get it.
Maybe we'll pull up an image just for visual.
It restarted.
Oh. Can you go to the end where the black slide is, please? So let's see, where to start? I mean, maybe we should start with the phallus, because isn't that where everything starts?
Or ends.
Or ends. Because, obviously people often comment on the number of phalluses in the exhibition. And I'm always actually struck by that for a couple of reasons. I mean, one is the obvious interpretation that people aren't used to seeing that in contemporary art largely, but also that there's so much genitalia in the exhibition, and there are so many female forms that include genitalia and breasts, that it just seems that I'm not sure it's actually accurate. I haven't gone around counting or anything, but I'm not sure that it's true that there's more of the phallus than the female forms, or even these more ambiguous gendered elements in the nuds, as Jack was talking about. So I just thought, maybe we could talk a little bit about your sense of Lucas's desire to show the phallus in so much of the work, but also the way that people respond to it, and whether you have some, thoughts about that in terms of audience and reception. Jenni, do you want to start? You look like you have something to say.
Sure. I was thinking actually when Candice was showing the bodies on the freezer structures, that in fact all of her work has a kind of reduction of women to receptacles, and all of there's a lot of metaphoric receptacles. So the toilet is vaginal in that sense. The bucket in the mattress is vaginal. The orifices that are the assholes where the cigarettes go become receptacles. And I think that the larger issue is I guess for me less about the phallus versus the vagina, but more about the binary. That there's a lot of binary. And it's very hard to get past the binary in the same way that I think at the beginning when I showed his and hers and Arneson, we forgive Arneson for his 1964 binary in a way that we don't forgive Sarah Lucas in 2019.
Yeah, I mean that was sort of a stumbling block for me too, because I actually think that it's interesting to have these phalli, I guess is the plural, partly because the phalli retain their mimetic function, whereas the nuddies, a lot of the other body-like, organ-like sculptures are suggestive of a body part or suggestive of some version of the body that could be sexualized, but are not simply like penis, There are, even in what you were describing, Jenny, it's vagina as receptacle or vagina as bucket, but the penis tends to be penis. It's just over and over, and the repetition of that.
But is that just a joke? Is it just the
Right.
butt of a joke that it's like
Right.
bathroom humor?
Well, that's why I wanted to reference the 1970s, 1980s, dominant form of just the news in England being full of tits and ass. Every day it was like a different page 3 girl. So you're just like, oh, here are the tits of the day. And I think the reduction of the male body then to this one part just over and over again. And there's an attempt at objectification. The question is whether it works. Is it objectification, or in a society still organized around the phallus, does it end up being a repetition that adds up to something, adds up too quickly to being then the organizing logic of everything, as opposed to the reduction of the phallus to just another symbol that's being separated from the self and turned into an objective, an objectification. And the whiteness of the phallus. At least some of the nuddies have brownness. At least the spider. It's interesting that the spider is black. I wanted to think about some of these other color schemes after listening to your presentation, Candice. The phallus seems uniformly white, and I wonder what would it have meant if there was a big black phallus in the middle of the show. We would have had to read race in exactly the way that you allowed us to, Candice, but that the show doesn't necessarily invite us to.
Yeah, I don't know what the question of are there more phalluses. I don't know why that matters.
Well, can I pick on something that Jack asked, and maybe Candice, you could respond to this, because I think the question of what does the repetition do throughout her work, really, because there's also the repetition of breasts in the mum form, of course, and in the nuds in maybe a less literal way, and we can look at the mum in a minute. But the repetition of the phallus here, which I want to read in some sense in the way that Jack is suggesting is perhaps one reading, which is just that repetition is a kind of objectification. There's an empowerment on the part of Lucas to be the maker, not the subject, and the obvious reversal of, centuries of art history in which it's usually the woman who's the subject, of course. But I think because of the way these are rendered, not only in their whiteness, but also in the kind of totemic and perhaps ancient relic quality that they have, that then in some sense kind of undermines the possibility of the former reading somehow. And maybe you could talk a little bit more about, because I think that your interpretation of them as these almost timeless objects, that perhaps have more of a reverent quality to them is one way that people seem to come upon these and to feel about them. And I guess I'm just wondering what that perhaps says about the male phallus and the way they're rendered.
Yeah, I feel like the ones from the Penetralia series are really different in tone because there are a lot of phalluses that like come earlier, like I think they're like magazine collage. So I guess I read them. There's like some that I read as being part of what I see as the class critique, where there's like, oh, art's not supposed to be the space where you have like dumb juvenile humor, so that's why she's doing it. But then the Penetralia ones, I was like curious because they do feel, yeah, more like these kind of ritual objects, but then they're not clearly phalluses to me. They're like also like the human becoming part of nature, right? Or like this kind of post-human moment of rethinking the parts of the body. Yeah, I don't know.
What is, I mean, maybe people could talk a little bit more about why you think Lucas wants to render the phallus and put it in the public in this way. Where do you think that's coming from?
I feel like actually it's a very old-fashioned sense of figuration. Like, is she actually a conceptual artist? I mean, we take her as a conceptual artist because she seems to have ideas, but in fact, a lot of it is, it's intuitive work. It's so intuitive. And she's purposely anti-intellectual in her interviews. She's anti-beauty. The descriptors themselves do not have a lot of, we take them as conceptual because she's deconstructing the body. But if the body were whole, is she just actually a figurative artist? Is she like a painter who can't paint, and so she makes sculpture instead of the body?
Jack, you've been talking about the prosthesis, and because these are live casts of a real person, do they still function for you as prosthesis, or do they do something different?
No, I think they are. I think that the best reading, in a way, I mean, okay, yeah, they could just be the return to figuration, but in the moment that they, that she makes them and that they become objects of aesthetic contemplation, I think that they're absolutely prosthetic. And in that respect, I find the work quite interesting. The fact that it's plasticast from her boyfriend doesn't really matter in the sense that most dildonic objects are actually plasticast from an actual penis. There are porn stars who have millions of their penises out there in the world,
But also women who do, there's fleshlights. There's,
Right.
porn star celebrity fleshlights that are vaginas that are cast too.
And they're cast from a human vagina.
Yes.
Right. So that goes to proves the point. All sexuality is prosthetic, and I mean, remember the show is called Au Naturel. I mean, there's no illusion here that she's somehow rendering, the gendered body in its most basic components. This is a recognition that the body is the sum of its parts, and that you can scatter the parts across the museum and look at them more closely, and that when you do that, there's a different understanding of body that emerges. I mean, we could even say, should we be calling these dick sculptures phalluses?
No. Right.
Well, okay, no. But
I didn't hear what she said.
they're clitorises. For me, the phallus has to be an organizing logic, and it has to sort of determine the meaning of other things around it, and I'm not sure if they do, in which case they're prosthetic, and they do become the kinds of objects that she's after. But what they actually signify, I think, takes us back to Candice's point. What is the signification of the white penis over and over again?
And also the absence of thinking about race. That in her utter milieu of the white working class British representations, there's an impossibility in thinking about other. That for her, it's the female is always the other. And I thought that your reading of the kebab was actually intensely brilliant. I loved it, so thank you for that. And the pita bread becomes another receptacle. I mean, it's one more receptacle.
Well, and it holds a piece of meat, literally.
Yes.
Maybe it is a piece of meat.
Candice, do you want to say anything else about penises, or can we move on?
I think we can move on.
Let's move on. Great, we're done with that. So I wanted to talk a little bit about androgyny, and specifically Lucas's self-portraits, in which she often positions herself in a more masculine pose, plays with gender signifiers. And I was telling everyone backstage about when we put this image in the window of the museum as a kind of advertisement for the exhibition. On day one, someone came in the lobby and was upset by seeing this image. And we came to understand that the person was upset by it because they thought it was a man making a derogatory, kind of rude rendering of the female, not realizing that it was the artist herself and that she is in fact, a woman putting eggs on her own breasts. And I thought that was interesting because the complaint was, how could we show an image like this in the Me Too moment, was how it was phrased. But nonetheless, I thought I'd love to hear from each of you about any thoughts you have on the self-portraits, and specifically the ways that Lucas plays with gender in these. They have been described as forms of masquerade, which I don't totally agree with. I'm not sure that's the right description. But there is clearly a kind of pose, and yet they're often also described as things that happen very spontaneously and are not necessarily, in a way the whole series, if you can even call it that, of self-portraits started almost by accident, according to her. So anyway, any thoughts? Anyone want to kind of dig into one of these, and specifically this one?
I look at this and I think actually about Linda Banglis and the image of her oiling her body and putting on the dildo, and the idea of trying on masculinity, and what that feels like as a form of power or taking back power. And it also, the other image that this makes me think of is the famous Woman House nurturant kitchen, in which the breasts are eggs, the egg breasts that a generation later becomes demoted and demonized for being essentialist, and that we don't have that response to Lucas. She doesn't get called an essentialist in this portrait. She gets celebrated. And so I think that becomes the gap between the 70s and the 90s that I'm really curious and interested in. So I don't have another response, but that's my response to thinking about what's wrong with responses to feminism, and whether or not she gets claimed as a feminist for this kind of an image that other women were demoted to being essentialist feminists, like Judy Chicago.
But I think she, especially seeing the show nowadays, I mean, I know the first time I saw this image and was looking at some of the self-portraits, I was like, wow, this queer, dyke artist giving a middle finger to patriarchy in the UK. I miss this completely. And then when you're like, wait, she's heterosexual? Like, how is this even possible? And it's like you said, somebody, Monica, I guess, said how deeply disappointing that was, and I share that sense of like.
I share that too.
Oof,
Yeah.
There's been a lot of mourning of the fact that Sarah is straight.
I'm really happy not to claim her.
Well, I think she's kind of gorgeously androgynous and is making much of her androgyny or masculinity in ways that then allow you to read those phalluses as prosthetic. And there's a whole set of readings that I was able to do that made me really warm to the work, that once I understood that this was actually part of a deeply heterosexual project, in the sense that her boyfriend wants his penis plastic cast and she wants to do it, and then her versions of female genitalia are way less beautiful in some ways. Just think chicken knickers. It made me worried then about images that I had happily read a moment earlier as parodic and hilarious and yes, let's get behind this. And that's ridiculous in a way, because you don't necessarily need to know all of this context in order to appreciate the work. But the heterosexuality, I don't know, there's some sort of mental gymnastics I have to do to then bring the work back around that I'm not even managing.
Well, is it a form of privilege that goes back to Candice's critique about her white privilege?
Yeah, I mean, I
Because of it's not about who she fucks, it's the commentary that she's offering on body parts, masculinity and femininity, that feels in some ways like it comes out of a very queer context. And it could be queer, but I don't get that sense, in fact, from reading the other materials behind the show and so on. So if it were an explicitly queer rendering of heterosexuality, I'd be great with it. I'm not convinced that it is. I'm not sure.
We're going to have questions a little later, so maybe just hold your thoughts
loud audience
for a minute.
I don't think it's about like who she fucks. I think it's about the larger questions of I'm surprised that Jenni, you were saying like she doesn't get called out for being reductive or essentialist, because I do find that's like the part that I find hard about the work, is the moments where it does feel that way to me. And so for me, it's not the disappointment of learning she's not queer necessarily, but that looking more closely at the work, you see how it is kind of just reupholding these kind of very heterosexual kind of ideas of that as natural, that as the thing that is given, rather than questioning it. Maybe less so in the Nuds. I think maybe there's more questioning of that in the Nuds. And I don't know. I don't really read the self-portraits as her trying on masculinity. I think of that as very much, I don't know her, but I think of that as like that's just who she is, in these kind of casual portraits of everyday life in her life. And actually, I was talking to Patrick's staff about her work to try to get some British insight into it, and he was like, "Oh yeah, she's a ladette," and I'm like, "A ladette? Did you come up with that term?" And he was like, "No, that's like a thing. Like in the '90s, like it was really cool to be a ladette."
What does it mean?
It means what it sounds
A
like.
ladette.
Yeah.
She calls herself a bloke also.
She does call herself a bloke, which is about a kind of a male persona, which I think, I wonder if this is, if we moved the fried eggs to her knees, is that actually sillier? Like, what if she had put the fried eggs on her knees? Like, I would like to see versions of this, not just a singularity.
Maybe we should move to the Nuds. Here's another self-portrait.
She's also always doing manspreading. Can I just say that?
Yeah.
Which is very purposeful.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a very particular position. And we can talk about the egg wall if you guys want, but we're kind of running out of time, so maybe we should end with the Nuds, and then we can go to a couple questions in the audience. Anyone want to take these on?
Well, you were saying that one reference point that Lucas pointed to when talking about her work was Eva Hesse, and these pieces are very reminiscent of Hesse's work and the way in which the body gets turned inside out, so that we see, we think of the body, we're fooled into thinking the body as this seamless surface that can then be made beautiful or ugly in various ways. But the Nuds remind us of the complicated internal organs and the way in which they also are the body and also have a kind of representational function. And Hesse was so good at, producing these organ-like objects that I think the Nuds are really reminiscent of. They're sort of organic and, post-natural all at once. So I I'm quite taken with the nuds, and you were saying that you really like the bronzed ones, right, Candice?
No, I actually like the soft ones better
you
than
like
the
the
bronze
soft
ones. I was saying that I felt like seduced by the bronze
Here's a
ones,
bronze
but
one.
ambivalent about them.
Yeah.
I like the softer ones. But yeah, I think that the nuds are more interesting to me than her earlier work because they take her interest in like penetration out of a kind of juvenile heterosexual realm and make it more about like you can't tell how many bodies are there, and then this kind of entanglement is less about one that's penetrating and one that's the receptacle, and it's more about this kind of intertwined, entangled state of being that I think is more compelling to me.
I think they're like de-skilled sculpture. I think they're kind of nice, but they're beautiful in a an easy way. I think that it's about de-skilled. This is what people do with clay. They make coils, and they do things like that in basic clay classes. And so I think that this is an easy form to make, and I think that it's about a celebration of the de-skilled sculpture that is part of our larger contemporary landscape in which everything is largely de-skilled.
Is there a feminist position in that de-skilling that you think she's engaging with, or a history that
Yes,
grows
because it's
out
on a
of?
plinth. That's a good point. It's on a plinth. So she's put it on something that's either a concrete block or some kind of riser. And so, yes, in that sense, it's a critique of masculine sculpture, but it's also, we've seen this kind of interpenetration if we look at the work of Louise Bourgeois, Yayoi Kusama, even Hans Bellmer to some degree. So that it's a historic lineage of work too that she's could be looking at, but might not be.
There's also, they also recall, though, for me, the sausage. There's this idea of the body being packed into material, either for consumption or the only thing that holds the sausage together is this like surface. And there's the way in which the female body is rendered grotesque by the materials that it's draped in. But the other thing is it's an oft overlooked connection between the female body and the bank robber, the two figures that use stockings in interesting ways. Somehow I can find that there.
Well, have you seen the image of her in the New York Times?
Yes, with
the Roberta Smith piece. She actually put a stocking over her head and
I rest my case.
looked like she was about to, go rob a bank.
Yeah.
But I like that idea of the casing, that it's
Casing,
the
casing,
sausage
yeah.
casing, that's
Right.
about stuffing the body within the body.
Yeah.
Any last thoughts before we open it up? This has gone by so fast, I can hardly believe it's almost 9 o'clock. But we have time for a couple of questions. If anyone has one, we're not allowed to call on anyone. They will come to you.
Hi, it's super great to see you all up there. Thank you so much for doing this panel. My mind's a little bit blown because I thought she was queer and not conceptual and parodic, so I'm like rethinking all of it right now. I have some comments and maybe a general question that I'm not quite sure how to phrase as a question, but it's curious to me that the context of like the early 90s didn't come up a little bit more. Like the culture wars were happening in the States and this kind of like interrogation of notions of obscenity. And I think doing work like this in that context, especially with like the relationship between Reagan and Thatcher, and that, like there was definitely a conversation happening overseas or between the US and the UK, I think, with regard to this kind of Puritanism. And then the sensation show happens. And it's also when grunge is really big, so I think the aesthetic and the kind of the materiality of the way she uses materials and form is certainly has to be influenced by the music scene also, kind of the where there's a bit more female drag happening, there's more, I don't know, fluidity or starting. But I guess I just want to know more about that. Like, what are your thoughts on that? Like, kind of the influence of that time, of the culture wars, and the attitudes about obscenity and Puritanism affecting art, and particularly representations of gender and genitalia.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. We didn't talk about that, and that's a really good point. In terms of also the first question around the phallus, like, yeah, it's a class critique for me that is like, oh, it's not supposed to be in this gallery kind of space, but it's also, yeah, a fuck you to the kind of neoliberal Puritanism. So I think that's really right on.
But this is why I wanted to push back a little bit to the 70s and 80s, not just as if she arrives in the 90s, fully formed, right? That the idea that the sensation show is shocking and obscene when she's been like, seeing obscenity every day in the newspaper for 20 years that's the comment, I think, is less, artists don't just sort of respond immediately to the thing that's happening in their moment. I mean, that's, and you're not even asking for that. There's a kind of bubbling, a simmering of material that I think we find in a more cooked version in the show. And I think that she is responding to the debates about obscenity, but sort of within a longer arc of thinking about how British culture divides up obscenity between the sort of, patriarchally legible is not obscene, and then everything else falls into the category of the obscene.
I think, Nicole, that's a great point you brought up, but I also think it's about, she was like in her early 20s when the 90s, then when 1991 was happening, maybe 23 or something. And I think actually, I would argue it's incredibly emotionally reactive work. It's not necessarily thinking work at that moment, and that all of the sensation is the show that comes to the States. It's actually not, the very first show is Freeze that Damien Hirst organizes in 91 of his peer group.
And the sensation show is later. I don't remember what year. Anyone remember? 88. No, it's
No,
not
it's
that
96,
soon.
I think, and that's the one that's shut down at Brooklyn. It's later, and that's the traveling show.
Someone could Google it for us.
Right, but but I think in the exact moment that she's making that early work, it's amid a peer group that feels incredibly disenfranchised politically and socially.
I just wanted to say, I think it's actually very difficult to talk about and think about Sarah Lucas's work because I think it's very complicated work, and I'm a little disappointed in the conversation. I am very struck by the very large wallpaper that shows heads of penises, many, many, many circles of the little mouth at the tip of the penis and the wet glands that is swimming. These circles are swimming in a pool of vomit.
It's soup.
Looks like vomit. Those circles resemble the circles of the nuts.
You can see a little bit here in this image on the left.
Yeah. So in the background is a kind of multi-vegetable-y, creamy, icky. It's a liquid. It's much more liquid than pizza. And it's...
No, it's soup. I didn't say pizza.
No, the girl next to me said pizza. She's arguing for the pizza. Read. But I feel really strongly that those circles are really strongly connected to the stuffed stocking circles that line the chair in the Nuds room in this exhibition, and other places where there are these circular forms. I feel like right from the start, she's deconstructing this binary. And the reason why I don't think it's that important what she says about her work or who she fucks is because many, many women artists have a really thoughtful strategy of not saying what they're supposed to say. So they say things like, it was intuitive, it was spontaneous. The idea that those self-portraits are not incredibly thought through, that the repetition in the self-portraits is something that she's absolutely insisting on, And as we were walking through the show earlier today, this evening, my friend said, you know, it's her presence on the walls really interrupts the kind of expectation of the viewer that's allowed to have an art experience. Because we keep looking up and there she is saying, this is my shit, fuck you. She's
I'm sorry
so
to interrupt you,
defiant.
but do you have a question or do you want people to comment?
I think my question is, do you have any thoughts on any of this? Because I think the work is queer work, and I don't care whether she's a queer person. I think the work is queer. So
Look,
maybe that's my question.
Yeah, I'm not trying to say she must be queer to, you know, as a lesbian to have a critique. It's just that I am not convinced, I'm not completely convinced that it is queer work. And at least one set of readings of Lucas's work has been that there's a kind of binaristic determinism in the work, and particularly given that she often is placed in a psychoanalytic context where you can then read the work as shuttling back and forth between penis envy and castration. The binarism is not being imposed from without. I think that you have to read the binarism. It's simply in your face as you walk through. And then the question is whether you believe that the binarism is part of a larger critique, and you just elegantly laid that out for us, or whether you believe that it actually stays firmly within the wheelhouse of a kind of patriarchal reading of the body. And I think that we can disagree about that while recognizing in the way that you propose that there are lots of deep intentions here, and that it behooves us to read, you know, more carefully into the work rather than dismiss it. I mean, I don't think anyone here would, you know, and I'm sorry if I was glib about the queer thing, but I think I was speaking for a few people who read the work and her self-presentation as queer and then have to recalculate how they understand the work in relationship to new information. That's all. You know, it changes things in a certain way. And it's not that I haven't determined that whether somebody's hetero or homo matters. We live in a world where it actually does matter. It's not for me to say that means something. It does mean something.
And I think it's, I don't know. I think you could say that the Nuds are queer work, but I don't think you could say that about the earlier work. I would still hold my position that it, to me, feels very reductive, binary, and heteronormative. And but I did read that wallpaper as hot dogs, not penises. Shows how much I look at a penis. So for me, I thought it was soup and hot dogs, and so I was like, oh, she's making another binary comparison. Anyway, different read on that piece.
Okay, one last question. Anyone?
Hi. I actually wanted to return to Candice's conversation about language, and there's something that Candice said that I thought was really interesting as a way to navigate the idea of jokes just being sort of synonymous with working class people or specific to tabloids and obscenity. But Candice said the butt to the teller of the joke, and the idea that something could be inverted, or I think maybe something like the butt to the teller being this opportunity of code switching, and that being queer, actually, the idea of code switching. And maybe, yeah, I just wanted to return to language as a mode of thinking about the work outside of just form, because it seems that using newspaper is a really explicit kind of material in terms of using and confusing language. And yeah, just wanted to return to that.
Yeah. Do you have anything specific you want me to respond to around that?
Maybe just like the use of language or things that are outside of language meaning one thing and having one specific representation, but the idea that it could mean two things, and that that is something that's inherently queer, or the idea that code switching is queer. And if the genitalia is read as literal formally, and I wonder if language is also read formally, or if there's opportunity for it to mean multiple things, and what people think, what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I focused on language when I was looking at her show because it was maybe the more interesting, like, kind of upending that I felt she was doing. And then the language, her attention to language maybe in these kind of familiar jokes was present in physical form even when she wasn't using actual words, right? Like, you could tell she was thinking about the words of the joke and then using them in the choices she made around the materials. So, yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I have much more to respond to that.
Okay, thank you so much for coming. Thanks to our panelists.